Hi, I'm Dominic. I'm the elder of local outreach here at Living Hope Church, and this is my second video going through the book of Jonah. So last week we looked at the introduction, and we saw that things weren't what they should be with Jonah. So Jonah is a prophet. He is a Jew. He is, by all accounts, someone who should know the Lord and who should be following him. And yet, when he is given a mission from God, a purpose to go and preach God's good news to this group, or I guess God's judgment news, he runs from it. He doesn't seek God and obey. He turns the complete opposite direction. And the question that we asked was, why? Why does he do that? So he gets on a ship bound for the complete opposite of the world from where God told him to go. And this huge storm comes, threatens to break up the ship, like completely destroy the ship. And all of the people on board, they're good pagans. They're good God worshipers. They worship lots of different gods, and they're faithful to that. They start turning to their gods in their moment of distress. And they even recognize that it's possible that there's a different God that they don't know of, that they're not praying to yet, who's upset with them, who's causing this problem. So they go to Jonah and they say, why aren't you praying to your God? Because, they're turning to their gods in times of distress. Jonah is sleeping below deck while all this is going on. So they go to him and they say, why aren't you praying? You need to get up and pray. And it's these people who you would not expect to be doing this. They're the ones prompting Jonah to be faithful to his God. And Jonah makes this incredible statement. He says, I am a Hebrew. This is in verse 9. So we're reading from the NIV translation, book of Jonah. Chapter 1, verse 9. Jonah answers, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. What an incredible statement about our God. That's true, right? He made the sea. He made the dry land. He is the God of heaven, the one true God. And Jonah tried to run from him, right? So verse 10 says, this terrified them. And they asked, what have you done? They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. So he told them, they had, in verse 8, they started to kind of grill him, ask him a bunch of questions. Who are you? Where do you come from? Because they cast lots. That was back in verse 7. And they identified that Jonah was the problem here. And so Jonah told them, yeah, I'm running from my God. And then he says, my God, who is the God of heaven, who created the sea and the earth and everything that's in it. And they're like, these heathens, they recognize, well, if you have a God who created everything, the entire world, he is master of heaven and earth, why are you running from him? Like, no wonder we're in the situation we're in. Come on, dude. Like, what are you doing? And they're terrified. It says, this terrified them. Jonah put the fear of God in them, even though he did not have the fear of God in him. It says in verse 11, the sea was getting rougher and rougher. So they asked him, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? Because they now recognize, okay, we've got a guy who worships the ultimate God of the universe, according to his own profession. So, well, what do we do with him? Like, we can't hurt him because then God's going to be angry with us. What do we do? So they asked Jonah, what do we do with you? And in verse 12, Jonah says, pick me up and throw me into the sea. He replied, and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you. So he's not turning to God and asking for forgiveness here. But to Jonah's credit, he recognizes that what's happening is his fault, that he is responsible for what's going to happen. For these other people, they're going to die because of his response. And ultimately, if you think about it in a bigger picture, he refused to go to Nineveh, right? I'm looking back. So in verse 2, God had said, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it because its wickedness has come up before me. Jonah refused to go. And in theory, you could say that Jonah was condemning those people to death because God was angry with them because of their wickedness. And Jonah was not willing to go and preach to them. So, and we're gonna get back to that, okay? But here you see a bit of a kind of a foreshadow of Jonah maybe recognizing a little bit, my actions have consequences. And when I choose to disobey the Lord, the consequences don't just affect me, they affect others. So he owns up to that. But again, he's not repenting really because he's not turning to God and asking forgiveness. He's just acknowledging to these other people, yeah, what's happening, it's my fault. He doesn't even really apologize to them. He just says, okay, well, better throw me into the sea because, really, this is my fault. Then you see in verse 13, and this is pretty incredible. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. So, like, Jonah, it's so incredible. And one of the big themes that we're seeing here is Jonah, who's supposed to be following God, is not. And the people who are not supposed to be following God, like who you would not expect to, all of a sudden now they are. Like Jonah, he wasn't even really trying to like convict these people or to preach to them. He just, and I mean, maybe he was, but he recognizes who God is because he's got the right theology. He doesn't have it in his heart, but he has the right head knowledge and he speaks that. Well, these people accept it into their heart right away. Like they see, okay, there's this huge storm. We know it's Jonah's fault because the lot fell to him. And he says he worships the greatest God of all time, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the earth. And they put their fear in God, the God of the universe. So these are pagans who now all of a sudden they put their fear in God and they're not willing to touch God's anointed. They know that Jonah has a mission from God that he's running from. They're not willing to touch him. They do not want to throw him overboard because they're acknowledging who his God is. And we see that in verse 13. So then, verse 14, then they cried out to the Lord. Now the heathens, the pagans, are turning to the Lord our God, the same God that you and I worship. So through Jonah's, and this is the incredible thing about how God works, right? Through Jonah's lack of obedience, his stubbornness, and even still his lack of repentance, these heathens have now come to, they're turning to the Lord. And they say, please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased. Wow. I mean, this sounds like that statement right there to me sounds like the statement of a seasoned Jew in the Old Testament. It sounds like something that Moses might say or David might say. I'm going to read it again. Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased. And I think it's also worth noting that twice in that statement, they use God's actual name. And you can see that because it's in all caps, L-O-R-D, Lord. And when it's in all caps, that means that they're saying Y-H-W-H, the name of God. So they're using God's personal name and they're crying out to him and asking for forgiveness because they know that Jonah is God's anointed. Then they took Jonah, this is verse 15, and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. So, I mean, you just saw, like that alone, if we took just chapter 1, that's the end of chapter 1. If we took just that, right? What you've seen here is you have seen a man who was supposed to be, by all accounts, I keep saying it because I want to hammer this in. He was, by all accounts, supposed to be an insider in terms of God's people, right? He was supposed to be an insider of insiders. And yet, He is stubborn. He refuses to obey God. He turns from God, and yet God still works through him. And that's another message that we see in the Old Testament, that once God chooses to work through somebody, all God has to work with are broken human beings, right? I mean, that's the reality of it, is we're all messed up. We're all broken. We all disobey. We all don't hear him right and think we're going about the right thing when really we're not. Or just flat out turn from him and disobey him. So all God has to work with is broken human beings. But what we see throughout the Old Testament is once God chooses he's going to work through somebody, he works through that person, whether they're on board or not. And I think a great example is of Samson in Judges. Samson was pretty far from serving and obeying and honoring the Lord. Like, he really disobeyed every step of the way. He hardly ever turned to God for strength or purpose. He used the tools that God had given him without giving credit to God. And yet God still delivers Israel from the Philistines through Samson, because God had said, I'm going to deliver the Philistines through Samson. Like, God was faithful to his promise. And so here with Jonah, God has chosen that he's going to work through Jonah. And Jonah is fighting it. And we're not exactly sure why. But Jonah didn't even make it to Nineveh. And this is another really important thing that I want to mention. So I was thinking about, at one point, my sin, my own sin. And I was thinking, gosh, if I sin and then God uses it for something good, did he want me to sin? Because then he could do something good. And I was kind of like, how do I deal with that fact? Like, if God does something good through my sin, or like, he does something good through my sin, then did that mean that it was good for me to sin? And Paul talks about this in Romans. Shall we sin so that grace abounds? By no means. The reality of the situation is God has a plan for us, and it is good. It is for our benefit and to bless us. We choose to disobey that plan. So God had a plan for Jonah. He wanted him to go to Nineveh. Jonah disobeyed. I disobeyed when I sinned, or when I sin regularly. What God does is he performs a course correction, because he understands everything. He sees all the infinite possibilities for how the future can go and how everything can work out. So I sin, and God makes an adjustment. And because he loves us so much and is so focused on blessing us, that he makes this adjustment that will lead me towards repentance and further bless me and others, right? So the storm in chapter 1 is supposed to lead Jonah towards repentance. It's supposed to get Jonah to quit fighting God and to go and serve God in Nineveh, right? That's the purpose. And that's a course adjustment, because what God wanted was for Jonah to go to Nineveh, to obey him. And that would have been ultimately the greatest situation for Jonah. But God knows that we are not perfect, that we're not going to obey him many times, the first, second, or third times. And he is going to keep working with us and even create in us a greater testimony, a greater story. He's going to redeem the brokenness. He's going to redeem the sin so that it can become something that leads us to worship him. And in this situation, you see that God uses Jonah, even though Jonah is not looking to be used. He turns these heathens, these pagans, to repentance. He turns them, God turns their hearts to worship him. And they offer a sacrifice to him, and they make vows to him. So they have just seen something incredible. They have had an encounter with the living God, and they turn to him. And yet Jonah is supposed to know the living God, and he's turning away from him. And that's the complete opposite of how we're supposed to go. We're supposed to be seeking God constantly and turning towards Him from our sin towards God. Jonah is turning from God towards his sin. And in reality, how many of us do that too? So I think I'm going to stop there, and then we'll pick up with chapter 2. Actually, I guess chapter 1 does have another verse, but that's in the next section. So we'll get to that in the next video. But thanks for watching, and I hope this was a blessing to you.